It was one of those evenings when the cold seemed to seep into the bones of the town, where the light from the street lamps never quite reached the edges of the road. I'd finished my shift at the small gas station on the edge of the highway, and the walk home was quiet, except for the crunch of gravel under my boots. Out here in the hills, sound has a way of traveling wrong. It bends, stretches, comes from directions that make no sense. Sometimes it's an owl you'd swear was calling from behind you, only to find it perched in front of you. Sometimes it's the pines themselves, groaning as if they're leaning in to share something meant only for you. That night, the air was still, no wind, no distant car engines, no dogs barking, just the steady rhythm of my own steps. I was halfway past the dark wall of trees when I heard it, my name. It wasn't shouted, it wasn't even spoken loudly enough to reach me in any normal way. It was a soft, low call, almost like someone leaning close to your ear, only there was no one beside me. I stopped, breath clouding the air in front of me, and turned toward the tree line. The pines stood there, like a crowd in mourning, black shapes, against a dull gray sky. I waited for movement, a flashlight beam, a figure stepping between the trunks, but there was nothing. The air seemed thicker near the trees, like the dark between them had weight. I told myself it was probably just someone from town. Maybe Earl from the diner had cut through the woods and spotted me. But even as I thought it, I knew I didn't recognize the voice. It was unfamiliar, but not in a way that made me uneasy right away. There was a softness to it, a strange gentleness that pulled at my attention like a thread. I called back, my voice, too loud against the quiet. No answer. I waited another minute, my eyes scanning the spaces between the trunks, but the longer I looked, the more it felt like the forest was leaning in, watching. I forced myself to keep walking. My boots felt heavier than before, like each step was a decision. I didn't look back, but I could feel the pines at my back, the same way you can feel a storm coming before you hear the thunder. When I got home, I locked the door and went about my routine, though I was more restless than usual. I couldn't seem to focus on the television, couldn't settle into the comfort of my worn armchair. Somewhere in the background of my thoughts, the voice lingered. Later, as I lay in bed, I thought about how it had sounded. It wasn't just the way it said my name, it was the tone. Like it knew me, like it had been waiting for me to pass that stretch of road. I kept replaying it in my mind, trying to place it, trying to imagine whose face it might belong to. And then, just as I was drifting towards sleep, I heard it again, not outside this time, not from the pines. It came from somewhere in the room. My eyes snapped open. The house was dark, except for the faint orange glow from the street lamp outside, casting thin lines of light across the wall. I held my breath, straining to listen, but the only sound was my own heartbeat in my ears. Still, I could feel it, the echo of that voice, curling at the edges of my thoughts, like smoke. I didn't sleep much that night. The next evening, I told myself I'd take the long way home, avoid the stretch of road that pressed against the pines. It wasn't fear exactly, at least, that's what I tried to believe, but more of a need to prove to myself that I wasn't letting a whisper get under my skin. The long route wound past the old mill and through a shallow valley before circling back toward my neighborhood. It should have worked. But halfway down the valley road, with the sky bleeding into twilight, I heard it again. My name, not loud, not urgent, just there, a quiet thread woven into the cold air, unmistakable. It came from the direction I had deliberately avoided, the slope leading up toward the pines. I froze mid-step. My breath plumed in front of me, too quick now, the warmth of it dissipating into the damp air. There were no houses on that side of the valley, just frost-coated grass giving way to tree shadows. I scanned the slope, expecting to see movement, nothing. And yet the pull was stronger this time. Like the voice wasn't just calling me, it was inviting me. I don't know why I went. Curiosity, maybe. Or some instinct that said if I ignored it again, it would find me anyway. My boots crunched over the frosted ground as I climbed toward the tree line. The first step under the pines was like crossing into a different world. The air was warmer here, strangely so for midwinter, and the silence wasn't empty. It was full, layered, alive. Every tiny sound was magnified. The crack of a twig, the drip of melting frost from a high branch. The voice came again, closer now. It didn't say my name this time. It whispered something I couldn't make out, but the tone had the same pull as before, that strange mix of familiarity and comfort, like it was speaking in a language I'd forgotten I knew. I took another few steps, weaving between the trunks. The ground underfoot was soft with pine needles, the scent thick enough to taste. I kept thinking I saw movement, just ahead, a shadow shifting, a figure stepping behind a tree, but when I focused, there was nothing but stillness. My phone buzzed in my pocket, startling me. The screen showed a message from my cousin, "You home yet? Roads are getting icy." I glanced around, suddenly aware of how far I'd wandered in without realizing. The road was no longer in sight, just the endless vertical lines of tree trunks and the dimming light filtering through. A low hum began to build in my ears. At first, I thought it was my own pulse, but then I realized it was part of the forest, a vibration, subtle and steady, coming from all around. That was when I turned back. I couldn't explain it, but something told me that if I stayed long enough to hear that hum change, I wouldn't want to leave. Back on the road, I walked faster than I meant to. The sky was nearly black now, and every time the wind stirred the branches behind me, I thought I heard my name again. By the time I got home, the hum was still faint in my ears, like I'd brought it with me. Worse, the cadence of that whisper, those half-heard words, wouldn't leave my head. I caught myself humming the pattern under my breath, as I made coffee, as I brushed my teeth, even as I lay down in bed. And somewhere, deep in the rhythm of that sound, I swore I could hear a promise. "You'll be back." The dreams started the next night. In them, I wasn't walking home from work or pacing the streets of town. I was already in the pines. The air there was thick with mist that glowed faintly, though no light source was visible. The ground sloped downward in a way that made no sense, as though every step carried me deeper into a place that shouldn't exist. Roots coiled like serpents beneath the pine needles, shifting under my weight. Sometimes they curled away, like they knew me. The voice was always there in the dreams, never in front of me, never behind me, always just to the side, close enough to feel but impossible to face. It didn't say my name anymore. It spoke in phrases I couldn't repeat upon waking, a language that slid right through my mind without touching words, yet I understood it. Or maybe I just felt like I did. When I woke, the hum from the woods was still there, so faint I had to hold my breath to hear it. I couldn't tell anymore if it was in my ears or somewhere deeper, threaded through the pulse in my skull. By the third night of dreams, the voice had changed. It carried an urgency I hadn't heard before, a weight behind each wordless call. I began catching glimpses in the dream, a pale hand slipping behind a tree trunk, the sway of dark fabric vanishing into the mist. I didn't tell anyone about it. Not my cousin, not the guys at work, not even my aunt who always seemed to know when something was wrong. Talking about it felt dangerous, like acknowledging it aloud would make it stronger. But the days were getting strange too. I'd catch myself staring at the woods from my porch for minutes at a time, eyes searching for a movement I knew I wouldn't see. The scent of pine seemed to follow me everywhere, in my clothes, in the steam from my coffee, even in the pages of books I opened. One evening, As the sky was the color of bruised steel, I stepped outside to take the trash out. That was when I heard it. Not my name this time, not the whisper from before, 2 words. It's time. Clear, soft, just beyond the chain-link fence that marked the start of my neighbor's property, which ran all the way to the tree line. My breath caught. I turned toward the sound, but the woods looked the same as always. Dark, watchful, indifferent. Still, something inside me shifted. The voice no longer felt like a passing encounter, a strange incident I could ignore. It was an instruction, a summons. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, the hum now steady and loud in my head. The house felt too small, too airless, as if the walls were pressing closer with each minute I resisted. Every so often, I thought I heard the faint crunch of footsteps outside, pacing the edge of my yard. By dawn, I knew I'd go back. It wasn't a decision I made so much as something I realized had already been decided for me. The voice hadn't called again, but I could feel it waiting, patient in the way of old things that know time means nothing. The pines wanted me, and I was beginning to want them back. The day I went back, the weather was wrong for winter. The air was warmer than it should have been, damp with a scent like rain that never came. Clouds hung low, their edges ragged, and the light had that dull, heavy quality that makes the world feel paused. I didn't tell myself I was going for a walk. I didn't make excuses. I just pulled on my boots, zipped my coat, and headed toward the tree line, like a man answering a knock at the door. The moment I stepped under the pines, the warmth deepened, the hum returned, steady now, vibrating in my chest, as if my own heartbeat had fallen into sync with it. The ground was soft, thick with years of needles that muffled my steps. The voice came quickly this time, just ahead, never loud, but clear enough that I felt my pace quicken. I caught myself glancing over my shoulder, though I didn't know why. Maybe to check that I wasn't walking away from something important. As I moved deeper, the forest began to feel deliberate. The trees leaned at angles that seemed to guide me forward. Patches of moss shone faintly green in the dim light, marking a path that wasn't there before. And the shapes, God, the shapes, always in my peripheral vision. A figure stepping behind a trunk, just as I turned my head. The sense of someone walking parallel to me, matching my pace but never crossing into sight. The air smelled richer here. Pine, yes, but also wet earth, and something sweeter, sharper, a scent that made the back of my throat ache. It reminded me of the metallic tang of blood, though I couldn't say why. I passed a fallen tree, its bleached limbs arched like ribs. Beyond it, stones had been stacked into a waist-high spiral. I reached out to touch one, and the hum surged, thrumming against my fingertips, until my hand went numb. I drew back fast, but not from fear, from the sense that I'd just interrupted something alive. The voice grew clearer as I walked, each whisper curling through the air like smoke. I still couldn't catch the words, but they filled me with the same sensation you get when someone takes your hand, that unspoken promise of being led somewhere safe. Finally, the trees opened into a clearing. It was small, maybe 30 feet across, and the pines around it bowed inward, their tops leaning toward the center, as though in reverence. The ground here was bare, no needles, no grass, just dark soil that looked freshly turned. The voice stopped. The hum, too. Silence settled over me, so thick I could hear the faint crackle of my own joints as I shifted my weight. My breath sounded too loud in my ears. Then I heard it, breathing, not mine. It came from everywhere at once, behind me, beside me, above me, slow, steady, almost human, but not quite. It was the kind of sound that made your skin remember what it felt like to be prey. I turned slowly, scanning the bowed pines, searching for the shape I knew was there. But nothing moved, nothing broke the shadow. I should have left, I know that. But my feet stayed rooted, my eyes locked on the tree line, waiting for something I couldn't name. And then, just as the first chill ran up my spine, the hum began again, deeper this time, not in my ears, not in my chest. In the ground beneath me, the ground vibrated under my boots. The hum so deep it felt like it was pulling the marrow from my bones. I couldn't tell if it was coming from far below, or if the earth itself was breathing. The air had grown thick, heavy with that sweet metallic scent, and I felt lightheaded, as though the forest was drawing the blood from my skin. Then the breathing returned, closer, louder. I could hear it moving, circling me, in slow arcs. The sound didn't disturb the branches or crunch the soil. It simply shifted from one spot to another, impossible to track. My hands had curled into fists, without me noticing. A shadow moved between two of the bowed pines. Not a deer, not a person, taller than me, too narrow, its limbs bending slightly wrong. It stepped forward once, and I caught the impression of pale skin and something like hair swaying in the still air. But the moment I tried to focus on it, it was gone, not vanished into the trees, just gone. The hum swelled, and with it came a rush of images in my head, so fast I couldn't hold them. Faces I'd never seen, mouths moving in silent words, wide rivers under black skies, fires burning inside hollows of trees. None of them were mine, but they felt like memories. The whispers began again, but now they weren't drifting ahead of me. They were inside me, threading through my thoughts, slipping between my own inner voice. They weren't asking anymore. They were telling. I don't remember deciding to move, but I was walking backward toward the path I'd come from, my eyes locked on the clearing, as if turning away would break whatever thin thread was keeping me on my own side of something. The bowed pines seemed to straighten slightly as I crossed their invisible boundary. Step by step, the hum dulled, the breathing faded. The voice, that voice, didn't follow, but it didn't leave either. It stayed in me, quiet but present, like a seed waiting for the right season. When I broke out of the tree line, the light had changed. The clouds were gone, the sky was high and blue, and my breath rose in small white puffs. I thought maybe I'd been in there for an hour, but when I reached the road, a man I didn't recognize slowed his truck and leaned out to ask if I was all right. He said he hadn't seen me in days. I didn't answer him. I just kept walking until my house came into view. The lock on my front door stuck, like it hadn't been used in too long. Inside, the air was stale, the kind of stillness a home gets when no one's been moving around in it. That night, I sat in the dark of my living room, listening, not to the street outside, not to the wind, but to the voice, faint now, speaking in that same ancient rhythm. It didn't call my name anymore. It didn't need to. I don't hear it from the woods these days. I hear it in my own thoughts woven into the quiet moments when I'm not thinking of anything at all. It's patient. It knows I'll go back. Sometimes, when the night is cold enough, I catch myself standing at my window, staring toward the black silhouette of the pines, humming that pattern I still don't understand. And I swear, when I stop, I can hear it hum the last note back to me. The snow had been falling since before dawn, slow and steady, the kind that piles up in soft drifts without a sound. Out here in the hills, winter makes the whole world feel paused. Roads empty, houses sunk into themselves, and the woods hunched under their own weight. By late afternoon, the sky was still the same pale, flat gray it had been when I'd woken up. I was walking home from the post office, my boots crunching through the thin layer of fresh powder that had settled since the plow last passed. The air was sharp enough to sting my lungs, every breath a little cloud in front of me. The road curved past a stretch of pine woods, their branches drooping low under the snow. That's when I saw them. Footprints. They cut across the road from the far side, coming out of the woods and heading straight toward the other tree line. The snow was clean everywhere else. No tire tracks, no other prints, just this single file of steps, neat and sharp-edged, like they'd been made minutes ago. At first, I figured it was just a hunter, or maybe someone taking a shortcut, but as I followed the trail with my eyes, something felt off. The strides were long, longer than I could make, and I'm not short. There was no clear heel-to-toe impression, just deep ovals pressed into the snow, each one too smooth for a boot tread. Curiosity got the better of me. I stepped off the road, the powder squeaking under my weight, and followed them toward the woods. The prints led between two sagging pines, weaving a little but always in a straight direction. Then, without warning, they stopped. No signs of turning around, no broken twigs, no disturbance in the snow beyond. Just one last print, clear as the first, and then nothing but untouched white stretching out in every direction. I stood there for a long minute, scanning the tree line, my ears straining for some sign of movement. The woods were still, no creak of branches, no flutter of wings. Even the air seemed to hold its breath. A cold prickle worked its way up the back of my neck. It wasn't fear exactly, but something older, deeper, a sense that I'd stumbled across something that didn't want to be noticed. I backed away slowly, retracing my own steps until I was on the road again. The snow crunched loud under my boots, like it was reminding me I was still here, still moving. By the time I got home, the wind had picked up, rattling the loose gutter on the side of the house. I made coffee, sat in my chair by the front window, and stared out at the pale smear of daylight fading over the pines. All evening, I kept seeing those prints in my mind, how clean the edges had been, how they just ended as if the person had vanished mid-step. I told myself it was nothing, maybe someone on snowshoes, maybe the wind had covered the rest of the trail. But deep down, I didn't believe that. Later that night, as I was locking up, I glanced out toward the road. The snow was coming down harder now, the kind that swallows sound and light all at once. For a second, I thought I saw movement along the tree line, just a shadow slipping between the pines. I stayed at the window longer than I meant to, scanning the dark shapes for any sign of a figure. Nothing moved. But when I finally turned away, I couldn't shake the thought that whatever had made those prints might still be out there, watching from just far enough inside the woods to keep out of sight. By morning, the storm had buried everything under a fresh layer of white. The road outside my house was smooth and unbroken, the kind of snow that makes it look like no one's lived here for years. I figured the footprints from yesterday were gone. Just another strange little thing the weather would erase. I bundled up and headed into town for supplies. The cold had teeth that morning, the kind that bit into your cheeks and made the skin sting. The sky was that washed-out blue that only comes after a night of heavy snow, so bright it hurt my eyes. When I reached the stretch of road near the pines, I slowed. At first I thought I was seeing the same prints again, the ones from yesterday. But these were fresh, sharp-edged, clean. They started in the exact same place where the last set had ended, as if whoever made them had stepped back into the world right there in the middle of the woods. They cut across the road again, heading into the opposite tree line. And that wasn't all. Beside them was a second set, smaller, narrower, spaced closer together, like someone or something had been walking alongside. The two trails ran parallel for 20, maybe 30 steps before the smaller prints veered off, curving toward a thick cluster of evergreens and disappearing into shadow. The larger prints kept going in their straight, deliberate line until they ended. Just like before, no disturbance beyond the last mark, no sign of a fall or a leap, just nothing. I stood there a long time, my breath rising in short, fast clouds. The woods were quiet again, but this time the silence felt heavier, like the trees themselves were leaning in to listen. A crunch of snow behind me made me turn quick, heart thumping. It was just old Mr. Keating, bundled in a coat that looked older than I was, a plastic grocery bag hanging from his gloved hand. He stopped when he saw where I was looking. "You seen those again?" he asked. His voice was low, almost like he didn't want the trees to hear. "Again," I said, but he just shook his head. "Best not to follow 'em, not this time of year." I asked him what he meant, but he only muttered something about winter takers, and shuffled off down the road, leaving a ragged trail of prints behind him. I watched until he was out of sight, then turned back to the strange tracks. The smaller set was what unsettled me most. The steps were light, barely pressing into the snow, but the shape wasn't right for a boot. The front of each print seemed to taper into a point, almost like a hoof, but not quite. By the time I got to the store, the whole thing was gnawing at me. I didn't tell anyone though. Folks around here have a way of closing up when you start talking about things that don't fit into the everyday. That night, the wind came howling down from the ridge. Between the gusts, I could have sworn I heard something else in the distance. Not a coyote, not any animal I'd ever heard. It rose and fell in a way that made the hair stand up on the back of my neck. A hollow, drawn-out sound that seemed to travel through the snow itself. I stood on my porch for a long time, listening. The sound would fade, then return from a different direction, as if whatever was making it was moving, circling. When I finally went inside, I locked the door without thinking, and for the first time since I'd moved here, I slid the deadbolt closed too. By the next morning, I'd convinced myself I was going to follow them. Not halfway, not just to the tree line, all the way. I left early, before the plows had even come through. The snow was deep enough that each step made my thighs ache, but the sky was a bright, brittle blue, and the cold felt cleaner than it had in days. When I reached the stretch by the pines, the prints were waiting. Same as before, they started at that impossible point where no tracks should begin. Each one pressed sharp into the snow. Both sets were there this time, the larger, long-striding ones, and the smaller, lighter pair. The smaller ones seemed almost playful in the way they weaved and curved, while the larger ones kept that same steady, unwavering line. I stepped off the road and into the woods, my breath frosting the air in front of me. The snow here was different, heavier somehow, like each step sank deeper than it should have, and it was silent, not just quiet, but silent, the way the air gets inside a thick-walled room. No wind in the branches, no chickadees calling, no creak of the trees shifting under the snow's weight. The deeper I went, the more it felt like walking into a painting where nothing was supposed to move. The tracks wound between pines and bare-limbed oaks, sometimes narrowing so much I had to turn sideways to pass through. I kept glancing behind me, half expecting my own footprints to be gone, but they stayed, at least at first. The smaller set split off again, veering toward a low ridge where the snow seemed untouched. The larger set kept on, and I stayed with them. That's when I noticed something that made me stop. The snow inside each print wasn't smooth anymore. It was trembling, not like melting or shifting from the wind. There was no wind. This was a steady, almost invisible vibration, as if the ground beneath was shivering. I crouched to look closer, my breath pooling over the depression. The snow didn't respond to my presence. It just kept that faint, unnatural quiver. A sound reached me then, faint but unmistakable, a long hollow note carried on the air. It wasn't close, but it wasn't far either, and it had a strange quality, like it wasn't moving through the open air. at all but through something thicker, denser. I stood, scanning the trees. The light was beginning to change, the shadows stretching in ways that didn't match the sun's position. The prints led into a small clearing. The snow here was untouched, except for the last 2 steps, ending abruptly in the center. Beyond that, nothing. The space ahead was a perfect sheet of white, undisturbed in every direction. The howl came again, closer this time, and I realized something that made my stomach twist. It wasn't echoing. There was no bounce, no return of sound from the trees. It was as though the noise was being swallowed as soon as it left its source. I took 1 step toward where the trail ended, and that's when the snow around me shifted, not sinking, not blowing, rising. A faint swirl lifted into the air, like frost shaken from invisible branches. The howl came a 3rd time, and I knew then it wasn't a single voice. There were at least 3. I turned in a slow circle, scanning the trees, my boots creaking in the cold. The clearing felt wrong now, as if it had shifted under my feet without me noticing. The snow that had swirled up was still drifting lazily in the air, though there was no breeze to carry it. Each tiny flake seemed to move on its own, curling and twisting before vanishing. The howl came again, longer this time, drawn out until it almost seemed to split into separate notes, and beneath it, there was something else, a low guttural sound that rolled through the woods like a distant drumbeat. I backed toward the trees, my boots sinking deep, my breath loud in the silence between calls. But with each step, the air seemed to thicken, like wading through water. The larger prints were still there behind me, but as I moved, they filled in almost instantly, snow seeping back into place, until there was no sign they'd ever been made. The smaller prints appeared to my right, fresh and sharp-edged, angling toward me, before darting away again. I caught movement, not a figure exactly, but a ripple of something pale slipping between the trunks. It moved with an unnatural smoothness, too fast for the space between one blink and the next. The howl came again, closer now, and from a different direction. Another followed it, echoing the tone, but lower, rougher. Then a 3rd joined in, so close I swore I felt it in my chest. They weren't answering each other, they were surrounding me. I pushed forward, aiming for the line of trees, opposite where I'd entered, hoping to cut through and back to the road. The snow there looked untouched, but halfway across the clearing, I saw it start to move, small depressions forming one after another, as if something unseen was walking toward me. I stopped. The prints kept coming, step, step, step. Each one pressed deeper into the snow than the last, until the final was just a few feet from mine. And then, nothing, no shape, no sound except for that slow, steady drumbeat that I now realized was in perfect rhythm with my own heart. The howling returned all at once, a deafening chorus that seemed to come from every tree. It wasn't just sound, it was pressure, pushing against my ears, pressing into the base of my skull. I staggered back, hands to my head, but it didn't help. The pitch rose until my vision blurred, and the edges of the world seemed to darken. I turned and ran. My boots sank with each step, but panic made me stronger than the snow. I could feel them moving with me, pacing me, shapes darting between trees, just far enough away to stay hidden. Every few seconds, a shadow crossed my path ahead, too quick and too thin to be human. The howls didn't fade with distance. If anything, they grew sharper, as though the voices were leaning close to my ear even as I ran. My lungs burned, my legs ached, and still the tree line didn't appear. The woods stretched on, each tree a twin of the last, each shadow thicker than the one before. When the road finally broke through ahead, it didn't feel like an escape. It felt like the woods were letting me go. The howls stopped instantly, leaving the silence ringing in my ears. I stepped onto the packed snow of the road, chest heaving, and dared one glance back. The The clearing was gone, the tracks were gone, but the smaller prints, just two of them, sat in the snow at the edge of the trees, pointed toward me. I didn't stop walking until my house came into view, its roofline barely visible over the white mounds along the road. Even then, I kept glancing over my shoulder, certain I'd see those smaller prints following me in the snow. But there was nothing behind me, just smooth, undisturbed white, stretching all the way back toward the woods. Inside, the warmth of the house felt strange, like stepping out of a nightmare, and into a room that didn't quite belong to me. My hands trembled as I locked the door, slid the deadbolt, and shoved the old chair under the knob. But for the rest of the day, I tried to convince myself I'd imagined how close they'd come. I made tea, read the same page of a book 3 times without absorbing a word, but no matter what I did, my ears strained for the sound, the rising hollow cry that had been threading through the woods. It came just after sundown, faint at first, so far away it could have been the wind, but the longer I stood still, the clearer it became, the same drawn-out, bone-deep note I'd heard in the clearing, now joined by 2 others, each a slightly different pitch. The sound didn't carry from one direction, it came from all around the house. I moved to the front window and peeled back the curtain. The world outside had gone gray-blue in the fading light, the snow glowing faintly in the shadows. At first, I didn't see anything, then my eyes caught them. Footprints, 2 sets. They began at the edge of the yard where the snow was untouched, and came straight toward the house. The larger set stopped halfway, as if whoever made them had simply stood there watching. The smaller set came right up to the porch steps, and ended. No return trail, no side path, just the last mark, pressed deep into the snow. Toes pointed toward my door. The howling rose again, louder now, sharp enough to make the window pane tremble. I stepped back, heart pounding in my throat. The lights in the house seemed dimmer than they had moments ago, the corners of the room stretching into shadow. I didn't dare open the door. I didn't even want to be near it. I backed into the kitchen, every step creaking on the old floorboards, and stood there with my hands braced on the counter, listening. The cries began to change, no longer drawn-out calls. Now they were shorter, closer together, urgent, moving. It was as if they were speaking to one another in a language too old for me to understand. Then silence, the kind of silence that presses against your eardrums, until you start to wonder if you've gone deaf. I don't know how long it lasted, but I only know that when it broke, it wasn't with a howl. It was a single sound, from just outside the kitchen wall, a footstep, slow, heavy, then another. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the living room, with every light on, staring at the front door. The howling didn't return, but I could hear movement outside from time to time, the crunch of snow, the faint creak of the porch boards. When morning came, I finally worked up the nerve to look. The yard was empty, the road was empty, but in the snow at the foot of my porch, where the smaller prints had been, a fresh set waited. Just one step, and like all the others before it, it led to nowhere. I know these woods. I know them the way some folks know the lines on their own hands. Every slope, every hollow, every twisted old pine that leans just so when the wind comes down from the ridge. Out here, things don't change fast. If a tree falls, it stays where it landed until the moss swallows it. If a new track appears, you can bet it's from the same deer that's been making its rounds for years. That's why I stopped dead on the trail that morning. The clearing up ahead wasn't new to me. I'd crossed it 100 times, usually on my way to check the line of traps that runs along the far ridge. It's a wide patch of open ground, ringed in spruce and birch, the grass in summer always flattened by wind, and the occasional bear passing through. In winter, it's just a bowl of white, unbroken snow. Only this morning, it wasn't empty. A cabin stood dead center in the clearing, small, maybe 12 feet across, with a steep pitched roof and walls made of dark weathered logs, the kind of structure that looks like it's been here for decades, except I knew it hadn't. I'd walked through this clearing just 3 days ago, and there hadn't been so much as a pile of boards here. I stood there a long time, letting my eyes run over every line of it. No smoke from the chimney, no footprints leading to or from the porch. The snow around it lay smooth and untouched, like it had simply grown up out of the ground overnight. Caution told me to turn around, but curiosity, the kind that's gotten me into more than a few bad spots, pushed me forward. My boots crunched softly as I crossed the clearing, and the sound seemed too loud, like the whole place was holding its breath. Up close, the cabin looked even older. The logs were rough-hewn, the chinking between them cracked in places, but there was no rot, no moss, nothing to say this was an abandoned relic. The roof shingles were gray and curled at the edges, yet none were missing. I climbed the 3 steps onto the porch. The boards under my boots felt strange, not just solid, but warm. Not warm like the sun had touched them, either. This was a steady, living warmth, the kind you'd feel from a hearth fire burning inside. But when I pressed my ear to the door, I heard nothing. No creak of floorboards, no faint shift of someone moving around inside. I circled the cabin once, keeping my distance from the windows. The glass was dark, throwing back only my reflection and the white glare of the snow. The back of the building was just as pristine as the front. No tracks, no signs of tools or wood piles, nothing to suggest anyone had worked on it. When I returned to the porch, my hand hesitated on the door latch. The metal was cool to the touch, but it sent a faint tremor up my fingers, the kind of vibration you might get from touching a generator or a running engine. That was enough for me. I stepped back, boots hitting the snow with a muffled thud, and started toward the tree line. Halfway across the clearing, I made the mistake of looking back. One of the curtains, which I could have sworn had been tied open, was now drawn shut, and I could have sworn something was standing just behind it. I told myself I wasn't going back. For the rest of that day, I kept busy, splitting wood, mending a busted latch on the shed door, anything to keep my mind away from that impossible little cabin in the clearing. But come evening, I couldn't stop thinking about it, not just the way it had appeared out of nowhere, but that warm porch under my boots, the faint vibration in the door latch, and the curtain that had moved when no one was there. By the time the sun dipped behind the ridge, I'd already decided I'd take a flashlight, go back, and look inside, just enough to settle my mind. The walkout was quiet, the snow crunching steady under my boots. The trees leaned close overhead, their branches heavy with ice, dripping faintly in the cold air. When I reached the edge of the clearing, my breath caught. The cabin looked exactly the same roofline, same dark logs, but the snow leading up to the porch was just as smooth and untouched as before. No sign I'd been there earlier that morning. I crossed the clearing. The boards of the porch still radiated that strange warmth, the kind that felt less like heat and more like something alive. My hand found the latch, and this time I pushed the door open. It swung inward, without a sound. The smell hit me first, faint wood smoke, the dry tang of old timber, and something else I couldn't place. The air was warmer than outside, but not by much, like the heat from a fire that had burned out hours ago. The interior was one small room. A table and 2 chairs sat near the window. A narrow bed frame stood in the corner, its quilt folded neatly at the foot. Against the far wall was a stone hearth, swept clean, no soot on the stones, no logs in the grate. I stepped inside, my boots creaking on the plank floor. Everything was covered in a fine layer of dust, except for one thing, a plain ceramic mug, sitting in the middle of the table, a thin thread of steam curled up from it, vanishing into the dim air. I reached out. The mug was warm, too warm. I jerked my hand back and scanned the room again, my pulse quickening. No footprints in the dust, no coat hanging by the door, nothing to say someone had been here. And yet the mug was still hot. I moved to the window and looked out. The clearing lay still and bright under the moonlight, but something about the view was off. The tree line seemed closer than it had been moments before, the trunks darker, their shapes unfamiliar. Shadows shifted against the snow, though nothing moved in the windless air. A faint sound pulled my attention back inside, a soft scrape, like fabric against wood. I turned toward the bed. The quilt was still neatly folded, but I could have sworn it had been lying flat just seconds ago. That was enough. I stepped back to the door, my flashlight beam jittering over the walls. I crossed the porch and reached the clearing before I dared to look back. The cabin stood silent, dark windows staring out like blind eyes. But as I reached the tree line, I saw it again, the curtain in the front window shifting, slow and deliberate, as though someone was parting it to watch me go. I didn't sleep that night. I sat up in bed with the lamp on, staring at the frost on the window, waiting for, I don't even know what. The image of that curtain moving, stuck in my mind, looping over and over until the details began to change. Sometimes I imagined a shadowed figure behind it, other times just the faint outline of a hand. By morning, I decided to stay away. Curiosity was one thing. Walking back into something that wasn't right was another that lasted all of 2 days. On the third morning, I found myself hiking the trail again. I told myself I was just checking the traps along the ridge, but the pull toward that clearing was like a hand in the middle of my back. When I stepped into the open, I froze. The cabin was different. The front porch now had a wooden rocking chair sitting to the left of the door, something I knew hadn't been there before. It was old, the kind you might find in a great-grandparent's house, paint worn to bare wood in places, and it was moving, not much, just a slow, gentle sway, the kind the wind might cause, except there was no wind. The air was still enough to hear the faint drip of melting snow from the spruce branches. I backed into the tree line and watched for a long time. The chair kept rocking, steady and unhurried, like it had all the time in the world. That night, I brought it up to Mrs. Carver at the general store. She'd lived here longer than anyone. I didn't mention the details, just said I'd come across a cabin in the north clearing. She stopped bagging my groceries and stared at me for a moment before saying, "Best leave it be." When I asked her if she knew who it belonged to, she shook her head once. "Ain't a matter of who it belongs to. It's a matter of what notices you back." Then she rang up the rest of my things, without another word. I should have listened. The next evening, I went out again, not all the way to the clearing, just far enough to see the cabin through the trees. That was when I noticed the second change. The curtains, which had been pale and thin before, were now a deep red. They glowed faintly in the last light of sunset, and I couldn't shake the feeling they were damp. I stayed there until night fell, watching. Around midnight, a light flickered on inside. It wasn't the steady glow of a lamp, more like a lantern moving from room to room. I expected to see someone's shadow cross the windows, but there was nothing. The light drifted slowly from the front to the side, paused at the corner, then moved to the back, and that's when I heard it. A faint, steady knocking. It wasn't frantic or loud, just a slow tap, tap, from inside the cabin. The sound carried through the cold air, each knock spaced exactly the same. After a while, the light went out, but the knocking didn't stop. I stood there in the dark, counting the spaces between each sound, until I realized it was matching my heartbeat. That broke me. I turned and walked fast down the trail, refusing to look back. When I reached my porch, the knocking was still there, faint now, but I could hear it even over the sound of my boots on the steps, and I swear, it was coming from somewhere much closer than the cabin. I told myself I'd imagined it. Sound does strange things in the mountains, bounces, bends, carries from miles away. The knocking had to be in my head, just the echo of hearing it too long in the cold. But by the next day, the memory of it had settled into my bones like a bruise you can't stop pressing. I kept thinking about the red curtains, the lantern light, the steady rhythm of that sound. It felt less like I'd stumbled across something, and more like I'd been invited. That night, I decided I'd go back, not to the tree line, not to watch from a distance, inside. I don't know if I was looking for proof or answers, or just to quiet the part of me that couldn't stop wondering. The trail was slick in the dark, the snow crusted over with ice. My lantern cast a warm circle ahead of me, and every time I glanced into the trees, the darkness beyond seemed thicker than it should have been. When I reached the clearing, the cabin was waiting. No light in the windows this time, no movement from the rocking chair. But the moment my boots touched the snow between the trees and the porch, the air changed, warmer, heavier, like the clearing itself was breathing slow and deep. I climbed the steps. The boards were warm again, and the warmth pulsed faintly under my boots, in time with the memory of that knocking. I opened the door. Inside the air was colder than outside. My breath plumed in the dark. The smell of damp wood and something faintly metallic hung in the room. The furniture sat in the same arrangement as before, table, chairs, bed, but the details were wrong. The quilt was now spread flat over the bed instead of folded. The mug was gone from the table, replaced by a small glass jar filled with cloudy liquid. I set the lantern down, its light pooling weakly across the floorboards. That's when I noticed the dust. It was still there, but disturbed, not in footprints, but in strange looping patterns, like something had been dragged in slow spirals across the floor. The marks converged in the middle of the room, where the boards dipped slightly, and then I heard it. Tap, tap, tap. It was faint but clear, and it was coming from directly beneath my feet. I knelt, pressing my ear to the floor. The knocks were steady, unhurried, as if whoever, or whatever, was making them knew I was listening. Between each knock, I thought I heard something softer, almost like breathing. I ran my fingers along the seams between the boards, searching for any sign of a hatch or loose plank. The wood was solid, the grain smooth and dry under my touch, but when my hand brushed one particular knot in the wood, the knocking stopped. The silence that followed was worse. It wasn't the silence of an empty room. It was the silence of something waiting. I stood slowly, backing toward the door. My lantern flickered, throwing shadows that bent the wrong way along the walls. Just as I reached for the latch, the knocking started again. Only now it wasn't beneath the floor. It was directly behind me. I didn't turn around. Couldn't. The sound was too close, right at my back, as if a knuckle or a fingernail were pressing lightly against the spine of the door I was about to open. Tap, tap. I yanked the latch and stepped into the cold night air. My lantern swung wildly in my hand, its beams skittering across the snow. I didn't close the door behind me. I just went down the porch steps and across the clearing, boots crunching faster and faster. The knocking didn't follow, or maybe it did, and I just couldn't hear it over the pounding in my ears. The tree line swallowed me. I didn't slow until I was halfway down the trail. That's when I realized something was wrong. The forest felt wrong. The snow here was pristine, untouched, even though I had just come this way. My own footprints from earlier were gone. The lantern light caught nothing but smooth white, like the woods were trying to erase any proof I'd ever walked this path. I pushed on. The dark seemed thicker, heavier, as if the air itself was weighing down my steps. I don't know how long I walked before the trees began to thin, and my cabin came into view. Relief rushed through me, until I noticed the porch light. I don't leave my porch light on. The yellow glow spilled onto the snow, like a welcome I hadn't set out. My legs slowed without meaning to. The light made the shadows around my cabin stretch longer than they should have, curling toward the tree line. I stepped onto the porch. The boards under my boots were warm, not from my house, from something else. Inside the air was still, too still, too still. I set the lantern on the table and checked every room. Nothing was out of place, except for a faint smell, the same mix of wood smoke and metal I'd breathed in at the clearing. Then it started again. Tap, tap. This time, it was under my floor. The sound came from the center of the room, steady and patient. I stood frozen, every instinct screaming not to move, not to acknowledge it. But my eyes drifted to the rug in the middle of the floor, a rug I'd laid down months ago, and now noticed for the first time, seemed to bulge just slightly at its center. I backed toward the door. The knocking followed me, not growing louder, but closer, like whatever was making it had decided to match my movements. By the time I reached the door, it was no longer under the floor. It was at my back again. I stepped outside into the cold, leaving the door wide open, and didn't stop walking until I was halfway down the road toward town. My breath came in clouds that froze on my scarf. I didn't look behind me. When I finally did, just once, my house stood quiet against the snow, porch light still burning, no movement in the windows, no shadow in the doorway. But the knocking carried on, faint and even, as if the sound had sunk into my bones. That night, I stayed in town. That I didn't go home the next day either, but I knew I couldn't stay away forever. When I finally did return, the first thing I noticed was the rug in the center of my floor. It was gone. In its place was a single wooden plank, slightly raised, and from beneath it, tap, tap. The ridge has always been a part of the landscape I kept my distance from, not because it's far, it's less than a mile from my cabin, but because of the way it sits above everything else, a narrow spine of land, with nothing but wind and sky on either side. From town, you can see it stretching across the horizon, thin and jagged, with the tree line falling away near the top. People say it's bad ground, the kind of place you don't go after the sun dips, not because of bears or coyotes, but because it doesn't feel like it belongs entirely to the same world as the rest of us. That evening, the light was already fading when I decided to cut across the lower trail on my way back from checking traps. I'd been out longer than I meant to, and the cold had sharpened, turning each breath into a pale cloud in front of me. The trees thinned as I got closer to the ridge, letting me see the slope rise against the darkening sky. That's when I saw her. At first, I thought it was snow caught on a dead branch, just a flash of white against the darker pines, but then the shape moved, and I realized it was a woman. She stood near the crest of the ridge, her white dress catching the last of the daylight in a way that made it almost glow. She was facing away from me, her head tilted slightly, like she was looking at something far off in the valley. Her hair, dark against the pale fabric, lifted faintly in the breeze. I couldn't tell if she was young or old. There was something about the stillness of her that made it impossible to guess. I stopped walking. My boots crunched in the snow, the sound far too loud in the empty air. As if she'd heard me, she turned, not all the way, just enough that I could see the curve of her cheek, the pale line of her jaw. Her face was colorless in the dusk, her eyes too far away to read. But in that instant, I felt something deep in my chest, like I'd stepped into a moment I wasn't supposed to see. Then she was gone. Not gone like she'd walked away, gone like I'd blinked, and the space where she'd been was empty. My eyes swept the ridge, searching for a hint of movement, a shadow between the trees. Anything. There was nothing but the dark slope, and the wind curling over the rocks. I stood there for a long time, listening. The wind hissed over the ridge, but I thought I heard something else beneath it, a faint hum, low and tuneless, so soft I almost convinced myself it was in my head. When I finally moved again, my legs felt stiff, like I'd been standing in place far longer than a few minutes. I turned back toward the trail, and didn't look at the ridge again, until I was nearly home. Even from a distance, the slope looked empty, but I couldn't shake the feeling that if I'd kept staring, if I'd let my eyes linger just a little too long, I might have seen her again, still and waiting, her face turned toward me in the dying light. That night I kept the curtains drawn tight. I didn't plan on going near the ridge again. After seeing her, or thinking I saw her, I told myself it was just the light playing tricks, maybe the last edge of sunlight hitting a patch of snow. But the next morning, the image wouldn't leave my mind. The tilt of her head, the way the white of her dress seemed to hold the light instead of reflecting it. I tried to focus on chores, chopping wood, fixing the door hinge on the shed, but every now and then I'd find myself staring up toward that narrow spine of land, wondering if she was there again. 2 days later, I was walking into town, when I ran into Joel, my closest neighbor. He's lived up here longer than I have, knows every trail and hollow. I mentioned casually as I could, that I thought I'd seen someone up on the ridge. His face changed the moment I said it. Not shock, not disbelief, just a quiet tightening around the eyes. He didn't ask what she looked like. He didn't ask when I saw her. Instead he said, "Best leave her be." Then he tipped his hat and walked on without another word. I kept thinking about that all day. The following afternoon, I went back, not to climb up, just to walk the lower trail again. The sky was overcast, the wind sharper than before, and it carried with it a faint sound, soft and wavering. At first I thought it was a bird, but the more I listened, the less it sounded like anything living in these woods. It wasn't a tune exactly, but it had a rise and fall to it, a kind of wordless humming. It would fade, then come back again, always from the direction of the ridge. By the time I reached the point where the trail curved closest to the slope, the sound had stopped. That was when I noticed the prints. They were faint, almost erased by wind, but still there in the frozen dirt and patches of snow. Bare feet, the toes and arches clear, each step light but certain, leading toward the cliff's edge. I followed them until they stopped, not at a turn in the path or a patch of grass, but at the very edge of the ridge, a sheer drop down into the tree-filled valley below. I leaned out carefully, scanning the slope for handholds, ledges, anything. There was nothing but rock and shadow. No way anyone could have walked forward from here, and remained in one piece. The wind picked up again, and for just a moment, the humming returned, closer this time, almost at my ear. I spun around, expecting to see someone standing there, but the trail was empty. That night I dreamed of her. I was walking the ridge in thick fog, the ground beneath my feet, soft and uncertain. Ahead of me, just visible through the haze, was a figure in white. She didn't move quickly, but no matter how fast I tried to catch up, she stayed the same distance ahead. Her head was tilted the same way as before, as if listening to something I couldn't hear. When I woke, the sound from the dream followed me into the room, faint, low and coming from outside my window. I didn't have to look to know the ridge was out there in the dark, waiting. The next few days, I tried to convince myself I'd imagined the humming outside my window. Sound carries strangely here. It could have been the wind moving through the trees, a fox calling in the distance, anything but what I thought it was. But the feeling it left behind wouldn't go away. The same low pull in my chest every time I looked toward the ridge, like something up there was waiting for me to notice it again. And then I did. The ridge has always been a part of the landscape I kept my distance from, not because it's far. It's less than a mile from my cabin, but because of the way it sits above everything else. A narrow spine of land, with nothing but wind and sky on either side. From town, you can see it stretching across the horizon, thin and jagged, with the tree line falling away near the top. People say it's bad ground, the kind of place you don't go after the sun dips, not because of bears or coyotes, but because it doesn't feel like it belongs entirely to the same world as the rest of us. That evening, the light was already fading when I decided to cut across the lower trail on my way back from checking traps. I'd been out longer than I meant to, and the cold had sharpened, turning each breath into a pale cloud in front of me. The trees thinned as I got closer to the ridge, letting me see the slope rise against the darkening sky. That's when I saw her. At first, I thought it was snow caught on a dead branch, just a flash of white against the darker pines. But then the shape moved, and I realized it was a woman. She stood near the crest of the ridge, her white dress catching the last of the daylight in a way that made it almost glow. She was facing away from me, her head tilted slightly, like she was looking at something far off in the valley. Her hair, dark against the pale fabric, lifted faintly in the breeze. I couldn't tell if she was young or old. There was something about the stillness of her that made it impossible to guess. I stopped walking. My boots crunched in the snow, the sound far too loud in the empty air. As if she'd heard me, she turned. Not all the way, just enough that I could see the curve of her cheek, the pale line of her jaw. Her face was colorless in the dusk, her eyes too far away to read. But in that instant, I felt something deep in my chest, like I'd stepped into a moment I wasn't supposed to see. And then she was gone. Not gone like she'd walked away, gone like I'd blinked, and the space where she'd been was empty. My eyes swept the ridge, searching for a hint of movement, a shadow between the trees, anything. There was nothing but the dark slope, and the wind curling over the rocks. I stood there for a long time, listening. The wind hissed over the ridge, but I thought I heard something else beneath it. A faint hum, low and tuneless, so soft I almost convinced myself it was in my head. When I finally moved again, my legs felt stiff, like I'd been standing in place far longer than a few minutes. I turned back toward the trail, and didn't look at the ridge again until I was nearly home. Even from a distance, the slope looked empty, but I couldn't shake the feeling that if I'd kept staring, if I'd let my eyes linger just a little too long, I might have seen her again, still and waiting, her face turned toward me in the dying light. That night, I kept the curtains drawn tight. I didn't plan on going near the ridge again after seeing her, or thinking I saw her. I told myself it was just the light playing tricks, maybe the last edge of sunlight hitting a patch of snow. But the next morning, the image wouldn't leave my mind. The tilt of her head, the way the white of her dress seemed to hold the light instead of reflecting it. I tried to focus on chores, chopping wood, fixing the door hinge on the shed, but every now and then, I'd find myself staring up toward that narrow spine of land, wondering if she was there again. 2 days later, I was walking into town when I ran into Joel, my closest neighbor. He's lived up here longer than I have, knows every trail and hollow. I mentioned, casually as I could, that I thought I'd seen someone up on the ridge. His face changed the moment I said it. Not shock, not disbelief, just a quiet tightening around the eyes. He didn't ask what she looked like. He didn't ask when I saw her. Instead, he said, "Best leave her be." Then he tipped his hat and walked on without another word. I kept thinking about that all day. The following afternoon, I went back, not to climb up, just to walk the lower trail again. The sky was overcast, the wind sharper than before, and it carried with it a faint sound, soft and wavering. At first I thought it was a bird, but the more I listened, the less it sounded like anything living in these woods. It wasn't a tune exactly, but it had a rise and fall to it, a kind of wordless humming. It would fade, then come back again, always from the direction of the ridge. By the time I reached the point where the trail curved closest to the slope, the sound had stopped. That was when I noticed the prints. They were faint, almost erased by wind, but still there in the frozen dirt and patches of snow. Bare feet, the toes and arches clear, each step light but certain, leading toward the cliff's edge. I followed them until they stopped, not at a turn in the path or a patch of grass, but at the very edge of the ridge, a sheer drop down into the tree-filled valley below. I leaned out carefully, scanning the slope for handholds, ledges, anything. There was nothing but rock and shadow. No way anyone could have walked forward from here and remained in one piece. The wind picked up again, and for just a moment, the humming returned. Closer this time, almost at my ear. I spun around, expecting to see someone standing there, but the trail was empty. That night, I dreamed of her. I was walking the ridge in thick fog, the ground beneath my feet, soft and uncertain. Ahead of me, just visible through the haze, was a figure in white. She didn't move quickly, but no matter how fast I tried to catch up, she stayed the same distance ahead. Her head was tilted the same way as before, as if listening to something I couldn't hear. When I woke, the sound from the dream followed me into the room, faint, low, and coming from outside my window. I didn't have to look to know the ridge was out there in the dark, waiting. The next few days, I tried to convince myself I'd imagined the humming outside my window. Sound carries strangely here. It could have been the wind moving through the trees, a fox calling in the distance, anything but what I thought it was. But the feeling it left behind wouldn't go away. The same low pull in my chest every time I looked toward the ridge, like something up there was waiting for me to notice it again, and then I did. But when I turned to head back down, I saw something on the ground where she'd stood, a single piece of white fabric, caught on a tuft of brittle grass. I picked it up. It was cold, colder than the air, and damp, as if it had been pulled from deep water. I dropped it and left it where it lay. I didn't go near the ridge for days after that. Every time I thought about it, my chest tightened, and I'd see those eyes, black, bottomless, filling my mind, like they'd burned themselves into the inside of my skull. I kept busy around the cabin, chopping wood, mending gear, anything that kept me moving and facing away from that thin strip of land, high above. But avoiding it didn't matter. The third night after I'd seen her up close, I woke to the sound of humming, soft at first, like it was coming from far off, but as my eyes adjusted to the dark, I realized it was louder than I'd ever heard it before. The low, wordless tone drifted through the thin glass of my bedroom window, not carried by the wind, but riding through the air as if it had a weight of its own. I stayed in bed, listening, every muscle rigid. The sound would swell, then dip, like she was breathing it out in long, steady waves. In the morning, I told myself it was the wind again, or maybe my half-asleep brain playing tricks. But when I stepped outside, I saw them, faint depressions in the frost across my yard, a set of bare footprints. They didn't lead to my porch or away from it. They stopped in the middle of the yard, facing the cabin. That day, I closed the curtains tight. I lit the lantern early and kept it burning long after I should have gone to sleep. But as the hours wore on, the quiet became worse than the humming. The silence felt too deep, like the woods were holding themselves still, so I'd notice. Then, just before midnight, I gave in and looked. I pulled back the curtain an inch and let my eyes adjust to the dark beyond the yard. At first, all I saw was the faint silver sheen of frost on the grass and the skeletal branches of the trees swaying lightly. Then my gaze lifted higher. She was on the ridge. Even from that distance, I knew it was her. The white of her dress shone faintly under the moon, her shape too still, too deliberate to be anything else. She was facing my cabin, her head tilted slightly, just as before. I should have stepped away. I should have shut the curtain. Instead, I stayed there, watching. And then, slowly, deliberately, she lifted her hand and beckoned. The gesture was the same as on the ridge, small but pulling at me, like a hook, in the center of my chest. I gripped the curtain tighter, my knuckles white, fighting the urge to move. I don't know how long I stood there, but at some point, I realized she hadn't disappeared this time. She wasn't a blink and gone flicker of white. She was still there, still watching, still waiting. I stepped back, heart pounding, and shut the curtain hard enough to rattle the glass. I didn't look again that night, though I felt her presence pressing at the edges of my thoughts, until dawn. In the morning, I told myself I wouldn't check, but when I stepped outside, my eyes went straight to the ridge. It was empty, almost. Just before I turned away, I saw it, a pale scrap of fabric, caught on a low branch, halfway down the slope, swaying faintly in a breeze. I couldn't feel, and I knew then she hadn't left. She was just getting closer. There's an old mining tunnel in the hills east of town, a place most folks here pretend doesn't exist. It's not marked on any map anymore, and if you ask about it, you'll get a shrug or a quick change of subject. The mine closed long before I was born. After a collapse buried 6 men alive. They never dug them out. Some say it was too dangerous, others that the owners didn't want to spend the money. Either way, the mountain kept them, and the place was boarded up and left to rot. You can't see the tunnel from the main road. You have to know the old trails, the ones that snake along the ridge and through thick stands of oak and pine. That's how I found it, not because I was looking for it, but because I was out checking an old hunting route. I hadn't walked in years. The air was sharp and cold that afternoon, the kind that makes sound carry in strange ways. I'd been moving through quiet woods for hours, nothing but the occasional creak of branches overhead. The ground started to slope, and soon I came to a narrow cut between 2 mossy boulders. Beyond them, the trees opened into a small clearing at the base of a low hill. That's where I saw it. The tunnel mouth was set into the hillside like a dark wound. The boards that once covered it had rotted away, splintered and leaning, with just enough of a gap to see the yawning blackness inside. The rock around it was stained with rust, and streaked with something darker, the remnants of years of damp weather. I stood there a while, my breath clouding in the cold air, staring at that darkness. It was the kind of black that didn't just hide what was inside. It seemed to swallow the daylight, pulling it in like smoke disappearing up a chimney. I told myself I'd take a quick look, just to say I'd seen it. I stepped closer, boots crunching over gravel and old nails, and that's when I heard it. At first I thought it was just the sound of something shifting inside, a trickle of loose rock, maybe a small animal startled by my approach. But then it came again, clearer this time. My name, spoken plain as day. It wasn't shouted, it wasn't even loud, but it carried through the stillness like it had been dropped directly into my ear. The syllables were stretched just enough to sound off, like whoever said it hadn't used that name in a long time. I froze, heart thudding in my chest. The wind didn't move. No trees swayed. The clearing was empty. I took a cautious step back, scanning the woods. No footprints in the patchy snow around the tunnel. No signs anyone had been here. My breath came quick, puffing in front of me. The sound didn't repeat. The darkness inside the tunnel remained still, waiting. I told myself it was the echo of my own movement, the scrape of boot on rock, playing tricks. Maybe I'd heard a wordless sound, and my mind had shaped it into something familiar. Still, I didn't turn my back until I was halfway across the clearing, and even then, I couldn't shake the feeling that if I'd taken one step closer to that black mouth in the hill, the voice would have spoken again, maybe louder, maybe closer, and maybe it wouldn't have just said my name. I stayed away from the tunnel for a few days, told myself I had no reason to go back, nothing there but a rotting hole in the hillside, and a story no one wanted to talk about. But that didn't stop me from thinking about it. Every night, just before I drifted off, I'd hear it again in my head. That low, drawn-out way. My name had come out of the dark. It wasn't just the sound that stuck with me, it was the way it had fit into the stillness, like it belonged there. On the fourth day, I ended up near the hill again. Not on purpose, at least not at first. I'd gone out to check a trap line, and without thinking, followed the ridge trail that curved toward the clearing. By the time I realized where I was, I could see the mossy boulders through the trees. I should have turned back. Instead, I kept walking. The air felt different that day, heavier, somehow, like the sky was pressing down on the hill. The clearing was silent, except for the faint drip of meltwater from the rocks. I stopped a few feet from the tunnel mouth, my boots sinking slightly into damp earth. The boards leaned in the same crooked way as before, the gap between them, like a slit into a deeper night. That's when it came again. My name. This time it was quieter, but stretched longer, the syllables dragging like they were being pulled from far inside the earth. It was a voice, but not quite right. Too smooth in some places, too rough in others, as if whoever was speaking hadn't shaped words in a long time. I felt a cold prickle run down my neck. Without thinking, I called out, my voice low, "Who's in there?" The echo came back almost instantly, but it wasn't mine. The pitch was off, the cadence was different. It was like someone imitating me, without knowing exactly how I sounded. I stared into the darkness, my breath slowing, listening. Silence, the kind that fills your ears until you start hearing the blood in your veins. It went on long enough that I began to think the echo had been a trick, the tunnel throwing my own voice back, warped and strange. And then the quiet deepened, not just the absence of sound, but the kind that feels like it's pushing against you, like the air is trying to press into your skin. My ears started to ring, a high thin note I hadn't noticed until the world around me stopped moving. I took a slow step back. The clearing felt wrong now, the edges of it too far away, the shadows under the trees darker than they should have been. My eyes kept darting to the woods, expecting movement, but there was nothing. I turned and walked fast for the trail, my boots catching on roots and rocks. Even when I reached the ridge, I didn't stop. I kept going until the tunnel was well behind me, and the first sound of birdsong broke the stillness. Back in town later, I made the mistake of mentioning it to Tom Harper, one of the old-timers who spends his mornings on the bench outside the store. He stopped whittling and looked up at me. "Don't talk back to the mine," he said. "Some holes only answer when they want something." He didn't explain, just went back to his knife and wood, eyes fixed on the shavings curling at his feet. That night I dreamed of walking deep into the tunnel, my lantern barely cutting through the dark, and hearing my own voice calling from ahead. By morning, the dream still clung to me like damp clothes. I could see it every time I closed my eyes. The faint swing of my lantern in the black, the gleam of wet stone, and my own voice echoing ahead, calling me deeper. I told myself I wasn't going to the tunnel. I even took the long way up the ridge, meaning to skirt well around it, but the pull was there all the same, a steady weight between my shoulder blades urging me toward that clearing. By the time I realized where my boots had carried me, I could already see the rotted boards through the trees. This time I'd come prepared. At least, that's what I told myself. The headlamp strapped across my forehead, a sturdy flashlight in my hand, and a coil of rope slung over one shoulder. I didn't plan on going far, just a few steps inside, just enough to see what was there. The air shifted as soon as I stepped into the clearing. It wasn't colder exactly, but heavier, like it was saturated with something you couldn't quite breathe in all the way. My boots sank into the damp earth, the smell of wet stone mixing with the faint tang of rust. I stepped up to the gap in the boards and shined the flashlight inside. The beam disappeared after a few yards, swallowed by the dark. My own breath came back to me in shallow, uneven echoes. Then I stepped in, and the tunnel closed around me quick, the light from the entrance dimming faster than I expected. The walls were slick with moisture, black rock streaked with veins of iron that caught and reflected just the faintest glimmer from my beam. The ground was uneven, littered with bits of rotted timber from the old supports. Water dripped steadily somewhere ahead, each drop ringing faintly before being swallowed by the stillness. A few minutes in, the tunnel curved slightly to the right. That's when it came again. My name, not from ahead this time, from just behind my left ear. I spun around, light flashing over the tunnel walls, but there was nothing, just the dark stretching back toward the entrance, now a faint pinprick of daylight far away. My chest felt tight, my pulse loud in my ears. The voice came again, exactly the same as before, only now it was further ahead, like it had darted away into the deeper dark. I told myself it was just an echo, maybe sound carried strangely in here, bouncing off the rock in ways I couldn't follow. But the way it said my name, slow, deliberate, like it knew what it was saying, made that hard to believe. I pushed forward another dozen steps. My light caught the remains of an old support beam, the wood black and slick from years of damp. Beside it, the wall was scarred with old tool marks, the grooves worn smooth in places. That's when I noticed something that stopped me cold. Fresh scuffs in the dirt, not footprints exactly, more like drag marks, wide and shallow, as if something heavy had been pulled along the ground not too long ago. The edges of the marks were still sharp, not yet softened by falling dust. They led deeper into the tunnel, vanishing around the bend ahead. The air grew colder, my breath fogged in the beam of my light. I tightened my grip on the flashlight and took one more step forward, and the drag marks seemed to tremble, like the dirt had shifted on its own. That was when I heard the voice again, not my name this time, just 3 words whispered low, "Come see where." The words slid through the air like they'd been spoken right against my ear, but the beam of my flashlight showed nothing ahead, except the curve of the tunnel, and the black beyond it. My mouth had gone dry, but my legs moved anyway, following the drag marks deeper in. The tunnel narrowed after the bend, the walls pressing closer, the ceiling dipping low enough that I had to duck. The rock here looked different, less natural, as if it had been cut cleanly, squared off with tools. My headlamp caught glints of rusted metal driven into the stone, old nails and bent brackets left from a time when this place still belonged to men. The drag marks grew clearer, the dirt disturbed in long even swaths, like something massive had been hauled without care for noise. I kept telling myself I'd stop at the next support beam, turn back before I went too far. That was when I saw it, a wooden frame set into the rock. It wasn't like the rotted supports scattered along the tunnel. This was different. A squared doorway, its sides still smooth under decades of grime. The top beam was carved with shallow notches, too deliberate to beware from age. Beyond it was nothing, not shadow, nothing. The darkness in that doorway didn't respond to light. My flashlight beam stopped dead at the threshold, like it was hitting a wall, but there was no wall there, just an absence that made my eyes ache to look at. The air around the frame was colder, sharp enough to sting my throat with each breath, and from that blackness came the voice again, my name. But now there was another voice layered under it, speaking words I didn't understand in a tone that wasn't meant for me. The 2 voices overlapped, slipping in and out of sync, like they were trying to speak together but couldn't quite find the same rhythm. I took one slow step forward. The drag marks led straight to the threshold and vanished into that black. My flashlight inched toward it, and the beam just dissolved. No reflection, No return. The voices kept speaking, louder now, my name, over and over, tangled with that other language, the sounds curling and twisting in my ears. They didn't sound angry. They didn't sound kind either. They sounded like want. The ground shivered under my boots. At first I thought it was my own legs shaking, but then dust sifted down from the ceiling. The vibration was steady, like something huge was shifting deep below. My breath came quick. I don't remember deciding to step back, but I did. One foot, then another, my light still fixed on that impossible dark. The voices grew sharper, rising in pitch, the unknown words spilling faster. My name came again, stretched long and desperate now, like the last rope in a tug before it snaps. I turned and started back toward the entrance. My boots struck the tunnel floor harder than I meant. The sound swallowed as soon as it left. The air seemed thicker now, each step forward feeling like I was pushing against something that didn't want me leaving. The voices followed, not from ahead anymore, but from behind, weaving through the tunnel like they were sliding along the walls. Sometimes they sounded close enough to touch, other times so far away they might have been miles deep. When I saw the faint gray of daylight ahead, I nearly ran, but the moment I crossed the bend where I'd first heard them in here, they stopped, all at once. The tunnel was silent again, except for the sound of water dripping in the dark behind me. I stepped out into daylight like I'd been holding my breath for hours. The cold air hit me in a rush, the kind of sharp wind that cuts straight through your clothes. I didn't stop moving until I was halfway across the clearing, putting as much distance as I could between myself and that tunnel mouth. When I finally turned back, it looked harmless, just a shadow in the hillside, boards leaning in the same crooked way as before. If not for the pounding in my chest, I could have almost convinced myself I'd imagined it all. Almost. I adjusted the rope over my shoulder, ready to head for the ridge trail when it happened. My name, clear as day. It wasn't coming from inside the tunnel this time. It was behind me. I spun around, but the clearing was empty. The trees stood still, no wind to stir them. The only sound was the faint creak of the old boards over the tunnel entrance. I didn't waste another second. I walked fast for the trail, keeping my eyes forward. The voice didn't come again, but the feeling of being followed stayed with me all the way down the slope and through the woods. By the time I reached my cabin, the light was fading, the sky settling into that deep winter blue. I locked the door, stoked the fire, and tried to settle in. The warmth of the room should have been comforting, but the shadows in the corners seemed thicker somehow, and the crackle of the fire only made the silence between sounds sharper. I told myself a hot meal and some rest would push it all from my mind. I was wrong. Around midnight, I woke up to the creak of a floorboard. At first I thought it was the wood settling in the cold, but then I heard it, faint, but close. My name. It came from the far corner of the room, the one just beyond the glow of the dying fire. I sat up slowly, my eyes straining against the dark. "Who's there?" I whispered before I could stop myself. The answer came back almost immediately. My own voice. Not just a perfect imitation, exactly my voice, like hearing a recording of something I'd never said. It whispered my name again, then fell silent. I grabbed the flashlight from beside my bed and swept the beam across the cabin. Nothing moved. The door was still locked, the windows shut tight. Eventually, I lay back down, telling myself it was exhaustion, my mind replaying the memory of the tunnel. I must have drifted into a light sleep, because the next thing I knew, the sound was back. Not a voice this time, a slow, steady dripping. It came from beneath the bed. I froze, listening. The drip wasn't hitting wood or carpet. It was the sound of water landing on stone. The same hollow plink I'd heard deep in the tunnel. I leaned over the edge of the bed, my flashlight shaking in my hand. Before I could shine it underneath, I heard it one last time. My name. Only now, it wasn't alone. That other voice, the one I'd heard deep in the black doorway, spoke right after it, the words low and curling in a language I couldn't understand. The dripping stopped, the cabin went dead quiet, and in that silence, I realized something. The tunnel might still be miles away, but whatever was in there, it didn't need the tunnel to reach me anymore.